So we've talked about a lot of different distinctions that we make. Foreign versus kind of native, natural versus artificial. One of the most powerful distinctions is medical versus recreational, right? The idea that we need to sort drugs out and the use of drugs into medical and to recreational, with the idea being, for the most part, that if it's on the medical side, well, that's okay. And if it's on the recreational side, with the exception of, alcohol or tobacco or coffee or things like that, if it's on the recreational side, then it's not okay.
Right.
And that's part of the story, I think, of LSD, is that while LSD on the medical side was weird in the sense that many, practitioners at that, in the 50s and the 60s regarded psychedelic research as weird or maybe not appropriate.
Like
it was still very niche, that's for sure. But nonetheless, right, I mean, the research community was pretty serious-minded, and they really wanted to explore the therapeutic potentialities of psychedelics, and LSD in particular. And what happens in the 60s in the U.S. is that the drug jumps the line from medical to recreational. It's not a clear line.
Right, and that jump is very interesting because maybe it was also due to the culture that was there at that time, right? Like the sentiments people had. There were this distinction of like government sentimentality of like, I don't know how to even to describe it. But there's the other side of like,
you doing a good job. It's countercultural, right?
It's
and
like,
the drug gets bound up in this idea that psychedelics are countercultural in the sense that we're using them to experience the psychedelic, but also very self-consciously, right, to reject
kind of like a protest,
the structures of square society, right? Of straight society.
Square society is a good name.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's a rejection of
the
that.
Funny things about the counterculture is like it's not only like political, like it's political like in many ways, right? For example, like with the war in Vietnam, I think played a big role during that time, right?
Yeah,
there's like this people for the war, people against the war,
right?
And like you had the hippies, and it was like a mess. And just on that thing, would you say, at least I'm just as a curiosity, would you say that countercultural movement, was it mainly LSD or was it mainly like others, like cannabis products?
I mean, marijuana was the heart and soul. All right. So we keep hitting these topics that you could do a whole episode on. But right. So I will say this: the critics of countercultural drug use in the 60s and the 70s, the critics often saw that as part and parcel of kind of political dissent, which was, attacks on the war in Vietnam, or, attacks on racist politics, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And certainly President Richard Nixon, right, who's he's elected in 1968, so he's in office. All this is swirling, right? He believed that these were kind of one and the same. That the anti-war protesters were also dope-smoking hippies, and that it was all kind of part of the same thing.
Right, and there was some overlap for sure.
When you dive a little more deeply into the history of kind of the 60s moving into the 70s and the dynamics, it's actually a little more complicated than that. In the sense that there's a very new left politics. It's a radical politics. It's got radical critiques of capitalism. It's got radical critiques of imperialism. It's got radical critiques of kind of mainstream politics generally. Radical critiques of the war in Vietnam. Right. I mean, and the core of new left politics and the core of dope smoking counterculturalism overlapped, but they weren't the same thing. Because there was always an element of kind of radical politics that looked at kind of the trappings of the counterculture and drug use as distractions from like real politics. And there was certainly a big chunk of the counterculture that didn't care about politics, right? Didn't give a damn about politics. It was like, right. I mean, it's like, whatever, right? It's all a drag, right? Let me just do my thing. And there's an aspect of counterculturalism which is very individual. Like, hey, I'm just, I don't want to, I'm living my life. And so as the 60s move on, I think it becomes clearer that while there's overlaps, there's also differences between them.
Right. And would you know, this is like a fascinating topic, would you know anything about a little bit before that, or maybe even during that, the efforts of like the government to like study the drug for intelligent purposes and stuff like that? If you have any
I mean, let's just sure do another episode on that. I mean, I would say right. So when you go back to the 50s and 60s and the flowering of research, into LSD, for example, the potency of the drug was not lost on folks in the federal government. And there was certainly an effort undertaken to see whether or not a drug like LSD could be useful.
Right. In whatever purpose.
Well, and there were different versions of that. For example, one version of that was, was LSD finally going to yield a truth serum? Right. Could we use LSD
for interrogation?
Right. So put somebody under the influence of it, and could we use it to compel people to speak the truth?
Right.
Or could we use it, tactically to disorient an opponent or an enemy?
Right.
Could we? So there were different things that the government suspected could potentially be done with it. And so there was an extensive program of federally organized investigation into the drug, and conducted by Department of Defense, by intelligence organizations, by the CIA. So that's all true. It happened, and it very much was of a piece with that moment where the potentials of the drug were unknown, and the federal government looked for ways to turn it to their own ends.
Right. And do you know what kind of research or experiments were they involved in, or like how were they testing these things?
There are a lot of good studies on what the government did with programs like MK Ultra, and I don't know that I'm expert enough to give you the full detail, but they conducted a lot of human experimentation, right? They dosed lots of people to see what kind of impact and what kind of effect it would have.
Yeah, and I was reading that even like involuntarily, right? Like they without consent.
Let's just say that by the standards of modern medical ethics, or even frankly by the standards of mid-century medical ethics, a lot of this work was done in a way that looks pretty unethical.
Right.